Howdy guys, Jimmy Song here off chain. I'm going to do this by popular demand. My last video on Taproot was a big success. A lot of people liked it, enjoyed it, wanted more content that was like it. So in this video, I'm gonna go through Graftroot. I'm gonna warn you, I don't understand this quite as well as Taproot, and it's actually fairly dense, the amount of information that Greg Maxwell presents in his posts. So I'm gonna try as best as I can, but like, don't be surprised if there are parts that are going to be confusing. Partly because it is confusing. It's very clean and it's cool, but parts of it are not going to be that easy to understand. All right, so anyway, let's start with Taproot, because in order to understand Graftroot, you need to understand Taproot. And if you haven't watched the video, let me just give you a short sort of overview of what Taproot is. It's basically using MAST, sort of like a Merkleized abstract syntax tree in a particular way as to sort of hide the other condition. So you might have two conditions for being able to spend spend some particular Bitcoin. One might be the ability, if like all three people agree, like say we have some money locked up in a vault or something like that. All three people can agree, or if one of them died or something like that, the other two people can sign, and then you have to wait until you have to provide some amount of time until the third person is no longer around or something like that. Some time lock on the third person. So this is useful for sort of smart contracting in general, and it's fairly common. So, for example, you might say, okay, within a year, all three people have to agree, but after a year, two of three people can agree, and this can get unlocked. Such constructions are very common in Lightning Network transactions and things like that. And that's there's sort of an obvious case where everybody that's a signer to the agreement agrees, and then there's sort of this other case where some people don't agree, or at least one of the parties is not cooperating, in which case you have to sort of execute this other one. And that's the idea behind Taproot, is that you have two different sort of conditions, and you can hide the fact that there is this other condition by utilizing this particular construction of Schnorr signatures or MuSig or whatever. The idea being that if in the base case where everyone cooperates, which is like the vast majority, then everybody signs and it looks exactly like a normal one of one, or a normal signature. And that's very good, because it hides this other complexity, doesn't reveal that it's even a multi-sig, doesn't reveal that this other sort of condition under which it would execute, and so on. That's the idea behind Taproot. So now we're going to get into Graftroot. Again, this might be a two-parter, because this one is actually fairly long. It doesn't look that long. It's maybe like 3 pages or 2 pages or something like that. But if you know anything about how Greg Maxwell sort of writes, it's very dense with information, and you have to like sort of read every sentence very carefully, because you might miss something. Anyway, let's start and read this through. This was published Monday, February 5th, so that was about 2 weeks ago. That was almost exactly 2 weeks ago. So let's talk about it. In my post on Taproot, I showed a simple commitment scheme for scripts that is very efficient, that there exists some collection of pub keys, like an M of n or even n of n, whose authorization is an acceptable alternative to whatever other conditions we might want to impose on a coin. So basically, he's saying, okay, there's Taproot. It has some obvious condition, and then there's this sort of alternate condition. You don't have to reveal the alternate condition. Great. If this holds, then when spends happen via the plain signature path, the existence of the alternative is never revealed, providing privacy with improved efficiency compared to not being private at all. So he's pointing out the benefits of Taproot. Mainly, you have privacy. Nobody needs to know what the alternative condition is. And and the second part is that there's it's improved efficiency. You don't have to like sort of spell it out on the blockchain or bloat the blockchain at all. In fact, it's actually quite hidden, and nobody needs to know unless that particular path needed to be executed. Great. Taproot suffers from a limitation that it only natively provides for one alternative. So this is very true. Taproot has that one condition besides the main everyone cooperates scenario. You have some other scenario which doesn't get revealed until it needs to be. That is like somebody isn't cooperating and then you need to execute this particular path. But there's only that one particular path. And you might want multiple alternative paths. You might want one of three if like two people have died or something like that. There are multiple sort of conditions that you might want to have. And he does point out in the next sentence here, trees or cascades of taproots can be done, but they have less privacy and efficiency than just a single level. And this is extreme. This is absolutely correct. You can sort of have one taproot where three people cooperate. Like let's say it's 5 of 5. All 5 people cooperate. Great. It looks like everything else on the network. But if one of them doesn't cooperate, then you have 4, and then you might have like sort of a taproot tree off of that says, okay, if 3 of 4 of these people and some time lock happens, then money can get spent and so on. You can have sort of like a tree of conditions, but that's obviously less efficient because you have to spell out, okay, here's condition, here's the alternate condition to the root, and then there's a cascading taproot, so there's another condition to this one that just got executed and so on. If we can do everything on a single level, that would be more efficient and more private because you're sort of revealing the possible condition that it didn't meet each time you do a cascade of taproots or as you go down each level. A tree example given: a tree commitment has overhead that grows with the log of the number of alternatives, and this is some quick math here. Each taproot can have 2 branches, and the overhead grows really fast because the number of alternatives might be huge. So, but yeah, I mean, it doesn't grow that fast. It's log 2 of whatever the number of alternatives is. But anyway, it's still much less efficient to do sort of a tree of taproots. All right. However, under the taproot assumption that there exists some monotone function on public keys and nothing else that is sufficient to authorize a transaction, we can do even better. Okay, I want you to understand that Greg Maxwell just packed a huge amount of information into this one sentence. All right, under the taproot assumption, okay, the taproot assumption that there exists some monotone function on plain public keys and nothing else that is sufficient to authorize a transaction. Okay, all right, so that's the taproot assumption. There exists some monotone function. If you don't know what a monotone function is, it sort of like increases. Here, let's actually Google monotone so I don't mess up the definition. All right, monotone. Actually, I guess we can do monotone function. That might be better definition. All right, so here's a monotone function is a function which is either entirely non-increasing or non-decreasing. Yeah, so a monotone function sort of always sort of goes up, right? So what he's saying is that there exists some monotone function on plain public keys. So what it's saying is, say there's like 7 keys or something like that, and then the next one requires like 6 keys. Next possibility includes 6 keys. Another one is like 5. Another one is like 4, and with more restrictions on each of those. Some cooperation. Ideally, you have all 7 just signing off. It's easy. If you have like 6, then you have some other condition on the person that's not cooperating. If you have 5, you have additional conditions and so on. That's the taproot assumption, okay? And that's and like he says it very succinctly, but it's actually conceptually like a big deal what he's saying. Under the taproot assumption that there exists some monotone function on plain public keys, and that nothing else is sufficient to authorize the transaction. In other words, you have some decreasing number of public keys that are going to sign the transaction, but as you decrease, there are more and more conditions. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. Anyway, we can do even better. Okay, so under this particular assumption, which is actually a pretty reasonable assumption, it's like if one person's not cooperating, what's sort of like the alternative that you use? If 2 people are not cooperating, then what's sort of the alternative that you use? If 3 people are not cooperating, and so on. And you may want those if you have a large number of funds. Like you need to sort of have like disaster recovery scenarios and things like that. So that's kind of what he's talking about, right? Like this is a normal way in which most people or most institutions and most organizations decide on things. They don't. You don't have sort of non-monotone functions in that regard. You don't say, okay, if all 7 people don't agree, then 2 of the people can agree. If that's not the case, then it's like 5 people agree. It doesn't go like 7, 2, 5, 3. Like it's sort of constantly decreasing, right? Like in the number of keys that you require, and you don't want to get to the next one unless like the previous one doesn't, isn't available. Hopefully that makes sense. All right. With Graftroot, the participants establish a threshold key optionally with a taproot alternative, just as they do with taproot. Okay, so there's a threshold key that they sort of like combine. It's sort of a similar construction to taproot, I imagine. I think the equations work out a little bit differently. Let's see, what was it? Yeah, so there was an aggregate key for 2 of 2, but it might be like 7 of 7 or whatever. Optionally with a taproot alternative, just as they do with taproot. Okay, and there's sort of like an alternative based on the threshold key, but this alternative is interesting. At any time, they can delegate their ability to sign with a surrogate script by signing that script with their taproot key and sharing that delegation with whomever they choose. All right, so let's parse this sentence. Again, like I said, Greg has a reputation for having very densely packed, like high signal sentences, if that makes sense. Almost too much signal. Anyway, at any time, they can delegate their ability to sign to a surrogate script by signing that script and just the script with their taproot key and sharing that delegation with whomever they choose. All right, so what they can do, you can, at any time you want, you can just sort of sign away your ability to sign. So if it was 7 of 7 and you hold one of those keys, I guess what you can do is you can sign away your rights to signing that signing by assigning it to a surrogate script. Okay, so that's and just the script, not with their taproot key, and sharing that delegation with whomever they choose. All right, so you can say, okay, well, I'm going to delegate this particular key to somebody else, or to this other script, which is like a whole smart contract in Bitcoin. Later, when it comes time to spend the coin, if the signers aren't available and the script must be used, the redeeming party does whatever is required to satisfy the script. Example given, provides their own signature and a time lock or whatnot, and presents that information along with the signer's signature of the script. So if you happen to not be around for your part of the signature, the other person can that person may have sort of delegated that to you, but only under certain conditions based on the script. So the script might say, okay, So I may, if I'm one of the 7 signers, I might say, okay, I am only responsible for this for a year, and I am signing this other script that says after a year has passed, like this other person can sign on my behalf, something like that. And that may be a condition of creating this this Graftroot script. This whole Graftroot is okay. Everyone needs to sign this other thing, this other script, in case you are not available, something like that, and then spread it among all the signers or something to that effect. Okay, great. The result is that instead of allowing only one alternative to one alternative, an unlimited number of alternatives can be provided. All right, so this ability to delegate your signature based on a script is the key thing here, is that instead of just one alternative, which is a very specific script, instead you, if the signer signs another script with the same key, then you can have sort of any number of combinations of different delegations. So if it was 7 of 7, then each person can sort of delegate based on whatever smart contract that they want. It's sort of like they have authority over their own signature, so they can sort of delegate it elsewhere to other people or other groups or other, like whatever, as creative as the script language provides, you can have any sort of condition that you want. All are executed with equal efficiency to a single alternative, and the number of them is hidden without overhead. Alternatives can be provided for existing coins too without requiring they get moved. Movement is only required to destroy the ability to use alternatives by changing keys. All right, so all are executed with equal efficiency, and that's because each holder of the key can delegate their responsibility to another script, more or less. And all are executed with equal efficiency to a single alternative, and the number of them is hidden without overhead. All right, so the number of possible alternatives is hidden. So I can delegate to 7 different people with 7 different conditions. So I can delegate to Alice and say, okay, after 3 years, and only if these 7 other conditions are done. And with Bob, like only if 2 years have passed, and these 3 other people also sign off, or something like that. Like you can have multiple sort of alternatives for each key. So there's sort of an unlimited number of possible ways in which that part of the Graftroot can get signed, and it's delegated more or less. And that's this is sort of expanding on the taproot idea, where you have everybody cooperating as sort of the base condition, and then only some people cooperating. But like the non-cooperative people, they have sort of alternatives that have sort of been distributed already. The nice thing about Graftroot is that you don't have to define all of these possible conditions ahead of time. You can actually, and that's kind of what he's saying here. Alternatives can be provided for existing coins too, without requiring that they get moved. So, so Alice, Bob, Charlie, or whoever, say they're the 3 key holders. Alice can give additional sort of. She can say, I am allowing, instead of my signature, you can use this particular script instead. And she can do that multiple times, and they can exist after the existing, even after the script is, the the address or whatever it is, it exists already. So it's kind of nice, because you can just sort of like infinitely change it, and each person, each holder of the key can create their own conditions for what allows it to get signed. Allowing this kind of delegation makes sense because the same signers could have just signed the transaction outright. Yeah, because Alice can say, okay, well, I will sign, but just in case I can't, here are the alternatives. And if you do that sort of before the signature happens, or before the address is created or the Graftroot is created, then it's then no money is at stake when, and this may be a condition, and you can sort of have a very rich tree of possible ways in which this can get unlocked. Or if it's sort of done after the coins exist, this may be more like useful for wills and stuff like that. Okay, condition A is all of the children agree how to split the money, then you guys get whatever. If only if after a year 6 of the children agree to the money or whatever, but one of the children might also say, well, in case I'm dead, 3 of my children have to agree or something like that, and each of those children can have conditions on whether or not they how they would split the money as well. So it sort of allows like a very rich statefulness. Well, not a rich statefulness. I think that's the wrong term. Sorry. It allows sort of a very rich conditional logic to the sort of conditions under which something can get unlocked. And there are sort of many possibilities because of this this thing he points out in this one sentence here. Alternatives can be provided for existing coins too, without requiring that they get moved, which is huge, right? You don't need to sort of establish a new will, and you can say each of the 7 children that that have control of the key in case I die or something like that, can sort of delegate their responsibility to other people in case they die or something like that. And this is really, really clever. The new script simply stands in for them if they're not available for cooperating. Yes. No special conditions are needed outside of the surrogate script on when the surrogate is allowed, because they can be written inside the surrogate. No special conditions are needed outside of the surrogate script on when the surrogate script is allowed, because they can be written inside the surrogate. Yes. So you can you don't need to specify that this script executes only when X, Y, or Z, because you can say X, Y, Z and this surrogate script. So that's part of the innovation here. We've discussed delegation in script. So he goes through sort of like the history of delegating in script and how that was that didn't really ever get past sort of like the discussion stage. But the case where delegation is accomplished with a simple unconditional signature is an especially simple case, and under the taproot assumption, the only case that is ever needed. So basically he's saying, wow, this fits really great with the taproot assumption, monotonic function of signatures and stuff like that. So a naive implementation of this idea requires a complete signature every time a surrogate is used, which means 64 bytes of data. This is higher overhead than taproot. Okay, so so for each surrogate script, right? So if you have 3 people, Alice, Bob, and Charlie, Alice does some sort of delegation to somebody else, like 2 other people or something like that. Bob does a delegation to 5 other people, and Charlie does to 1 other person. Then each of those has to have 64 bytes of data. And this is obviously higher overhead than taproot, which I think is only 32. However, the non-interactive Schnorr aggregation trick can be applied to merge the S values of all Graftroots and signatures in a transaction into a single aggregate. With this approach, only a single R value for each Graftroot need be published, lowering the overhead to 32 bytes. So there's a Schnorr aggregation trick that's really cool. I still have to study it, but more or less you can take 2 signatures and combine it, and it's instead of 2 32-byte signatures, you can combine them and they're still 32 bytes. It's something that I still have to study. Maybe I'll do it in a future video. This has a side benefit of binding the published graphs to a particular transaction, which might help avoid some screw-ups. So the published graphs have to go to a particular transaction. So because the R value, right, Right. So the published graphs are bound to a particular transaction, so you can't reuse them, I guess. Yeah. All right, so this is going over in case the taproot assumption doesn't hold. Taproot can still be used by setting the public key to a nums point. Yeah, I got to be honest, I'm not really sure what a nums point is. So I will try to get the rest of it in another video. But here's, but more or less, Graftroot allows you to sort of delegate your signature and sort of any multi-sig scenario where you have like 3 of 3 or 4 of 4 or whatever, and each person in that 3 of 3 or 4 of 4 can sort of delegate sort of in addition to their just straight up signing, which can be very useful. And I can see this being used in a lot of other places, and like it's very clever. It uses a lot of different tricks. So anyway, let's see if there are any questions. Would Graftroot be used for gambling or insurance? I guess you can. Yeah, I mean, at some point, sure. I imagine. Yeah, I mean, if you can determine death on a blockchain, I imagine it would be really useful. But yeah, I'm not sure. Anyway, that's about it. Hopefully that was useful to you. I'll try to get the. I'm gonna have to email Greg and be like, what's the nums number? Or somebody. If one of you guys know, please let me know, because I don't know what a nums point is. And that prevents me from sort of getting this last part. So anyway, thanks for watching. Hopefully this was useful. Anyway, this song is done.